If you are working within the pharmaceutical industry, or within fermentation, or with cell growth, or growth of any kind, this could be livestock or salmons, you are monitoring curves. And the reason you're monitoring curves is that maybe the curve in itself is your quality, like how fast it's going upwards, or you believe that the variation in the curve somehow affects your end product. Now, because we are in this situation where our data cannot be just simply put into a cell, like a single cell in a spreadsheet, data analysis becomes much more problematic. I'm going to share with you two examples today. One that is very polished and simple so we can explain it, and a second which is less polished. If you have any questions to this, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. In example one, we're looking at 24 different curves, and these represent 24 different batches, and we're trying to understand the shelf life of a drug. So sometimes our drug will have a very long and nice shelf life, meaning that we can keep it in the shelf for longer periods of time and make more money selling that product. But sometimes we get a really short shelf life and we will need to replenish that product more often, leading to less sale. So it's really important for us to understand what do we need to do to get a long shelf life every time we make this product. That can be difficult to explain because there's so much dimensionality in a curve. So we need some kind of number that we can optimize, and that number should represent when we're getting a long shelf life and when we're getting a low shelf life. So what I've done behind the scene is that I've breaking these down into different curves, and I've calculated what's called a functional principal component that explains when I'm getting one kind of curves and when I'm getting another kind of curves. So if I add that functional component as a filter, so I have it right there, you can see now by itself the functional principal component doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's a number I use to understand the curve behavior. So if I filter out all those curves that has a small amount of FPC1, you can see I'm getting these kind of curves that is optimal for me. They have the long shelf life. But if I'm getting curves that are with a low amount of FPC1, I'm have those curves that gets me quickly into the lower specification limit and getting a longer, shorter shelf life. So let's do that one more time. This is good. High FPC1 is good, and low FPC1 is bad. Showing the same thing but with a different visual, we can see here that this is the expected curve and this is FPC1. So if I set FPC1 to a high amount, I get the curve that I want, the long shelf life. And when I have FPC at a low setting, I'm getting quickly into spec and I have a low shelf life. So what I'm trying not to get. But I can't really go into the production and say, well, can you please set FPC1 to minus 78.95? They would probably ask, did the kids keep you up all night again? Because that really doesn't make any sense. So what we need now instead is to find parameters that we can control and link those to the FPC1 and have that then in turn linked to the curve behavior. Now JMP does this for us. So what we can do now is we can see at a low humidity and a low temperature, I'm getting the shelf life that I want. But if I increase humidity or I increase the temperature, I get a much shorter shelf life. Let me explain what is happening underneath the hood here. So here you can see my data, and I have batch information, I have the humidity and the temperature, I have the time, and I have shelf life. So what I want to do is go into Analyze, Specialized Modeling, and Functional Data Explorer. The Functional Data Explorer is only available to us if we have JMP Pro. In the Functional Data Explorer, we say that the shelf life is our Y output, the X function is time, the ID function is batch, and humidity and temperature is supplementary. I then click OK. The first step of the Functional Data Explorer is all about cleaning, because very often these data can be very messy. So here we have different methods for cleaning. Now, as this is an example for YouTube, it's very nice and we don't need any cleaning at this step. Down here, what we can find is the mean function. So it's literally the average function. So we take all the different curves and just mean them. This is what we would get. And here's the standard deviation of that function. And we can see in the beginning, we have a lot of different variation. Then the variation drops dramatically, and then the variation increases over time. I can then fit a model to this. After we fit the model, the idea is to, by using different knots, we'll try and explain this curve behavior. So you see, I can use a step function and one knot. We'll say, well, I have a high step and then I have a low step. Then you can ask yourself, is that a really good explanation of my data? No, it's not. So how about the linear? Well, it's better. And we can also see here that in our criteria called BIC, that had a quite dramatic drop. So that's definitely better. We want BIC to be as low as possible. And changing to the quadratic, it will drop that even further. Now you can see that by choosing the cubic, I go even further, but I would say it's also nice to use our mechanical understanding of the process. And so this is not a cubic function, it is a quadratic function. It's degradation over time. So I'm going to go with just the one knot and a quadratic function. Could also have selected more knots, but really I want to keep this simple, so we're just going to go with that. Then we scroll down and we can see down here we have the FPC and time. So the high amount of FPC, the low amount of FPC. And if I then fit a functional DOE analysis to this, I get the last very important part where I link my parameters to the curve. Now let's look at another example and go through the entire process one more time. And hopefully this will help you identify whether you could be applying this type of analysis to your own data. This particular example is a fermentation process where I am measuring the levels of ethanol, temperature, molasses feed, NH3 rate, the air tank level, pH, and I'm ultimately looking at the yield of this process. So for all batches, like if I just select just one batch, you can see I have 100 measurements, giving that I have 100 different batches and their levels and their yields. Let's start off by going into the graph builder. And we can see that if I look at time as the X, let's just take ethanol and we take batch ID into overlay. I remove all the dots. We can see that all the different batches have different variation. Right here, they're very, very alike. But what's interesting to me is if I put on a local data filter with yield, I can filter out those with a low yield and see those that have a lot of variation in the beginning, not so much variation in the middle, and some variation in the end, seems to be performing better than if I select those with a low yield, where I seem to have most of the variation in the middle of the process. So I could, of course, go out into the production and try out that hypothesis. But let's try and do this in the Functional Data Explorer. So again, we go to Analyze, Specialized Modeling, Functional Data Explorer. The batch ID is the ID function, and the time is the X. And this time the ethanol is the Y, because that's the curve we want to look at. And the yield is the supplementary information. we then get asked whether we need to clean up this data. I look at the mean function, I look at the standard deviation function. I can see all of my different curves down here. I fit a B-spline model. JMP then dissects this in by splitting the curve into knots, and between each knot I try and fit either a step function, a linear, a quadratic, a cubic. I select the one that has the lowest amount of BIC criteria, and I can see that that is the quadratic at like something 13 amount of knobs, or 12, somewhere in between 10 and 15. I'm happy with that. I go down here and I look at the shape functions. So this is where I make those principal components, and we can see that the first FPC one is explaining 65% of the variation. Now in the first example, we just had that one component, but that's actually pretty uncommon. Normally we would have multiple components that explains the variation. But the first one here explains 65% of the variation. Next one about 18, then 8, then 5, then 1. And just for making it a little easier, I'm just going to go with just the 4, because that will give me a 96% of the variation in the curve, and that will give me less FPCs to worry about. So I think that's, for me, is a good thing. I'm just customizing that I will only look at the 4 biggest FPCs. So now the idea here is that this is the mean function, and by adding these different shape functions to the mean, I can recreate any of the 100 batches that I have. So if I then plot the different FPCs to each other, so here is FPC, so component 1 is FPC 1, and component 2 is FPC 2. And I can really see that, okay, that one seems to really be an outlier. So this is just a great graph where I can plot the different components by each other. You can see that one looks really strange. I can ping them. I can also maybe instead change FPC1 to FPC3. So that gives me a different visual. I can see now they're gathered like this. Then we go down here, and we can see that by changing the amount of the different FPCs, I will get different curve behaviors. And then again, the really important part comes when I link this to the functional DOE analysis. So if I want to have a high yield, I shall have the variation in the beginning of the curve. And if I want a low yield, I don't know why I would want that, I should have the variation in the middle of the batch production. There's slightly more work still to be done with the last example, because now we understand what kind of curve behavior we want to get the high yield. Then we need to find out, okay, what kind of FPC levels do we need to get that curve? And we need to set those FPC with some specifications and figure out, well, how can we control our process so it stays within these limits we've set for our FPC components. This is a game changer for me, this kind of analysis, and I've seen it used for temperature curves for injection molding. I've seen it used in fermentation of yeast. I've seen it used for cell growth, where like trying to screen different media to what will give the best cell growth. So this was a slightly longer video. I hope you enjoyed this more thorough explanation of the Functional Data Explorer. But give it a like if you liked it. Leave a comment if you have any questions to what I've been showing. Subscribe if you want more content. A subscription goes a long way to help me. But thank you for watching, and catch you in the next one. Bye.